KaraokeBooks.
Father Sergius. Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maude, Aylmer Maude. Audiobook. Part 2. Kosatsky entered the monastery on the feast of the Intercession of the Blessed Virgin. The abbot of that monastery was a gentleman by birth, a learned writer and a starets, that is, he belonged to that succession of monks originating in Wallachia who each choose a director and teacher whom they implicitly obey. This superior had been a disciple of the starets Ambrose, who was a disciple of Macarius, who was a disciple of the starets Leonid, who was a disciple of Pausy Velikovsky. To this abbot Kosatsky submitted himself as to his chosen director. Here in the monastery, besides the feeling of ascendancy over others that such a life gave him, he felt much as he had done in the world. He found satisfaction in attaining the greatest possible perfection outwardly as well as inwardly. As in the regiment he had been not merely an irreproachable officer but had even exceeded his duties and widened the borders of perfection, so also as a monk he tried to be perfect, and was always industrious, abstemious, submissive, and meek, as well as pure both in deed and in thought, and obedient. This last quality in particular made life far easier for him. If many of the demands of life in the monastery, which was near the capital and much frequented, did not please him and were temptations to him, they were all nullified by obedience. It is not for me to reason. My business is to do the task set me, whether it be standing beside the relics, singing in the choir, or making up accounts in the monastery guest-house. All possibility of doubt about anything was silenced by obedience to the starets. Had it not been for this, he would have been oppressed by the length and monotony of the church services, the bustle of the many visitors, and the bad qualities of the other monks. As it was, he not only bore it all joyfully but found in it solace and support. I don't know why it is necessary to hear the same prayers several times a day, but I know that it is necessary, and knowing this I find joy in them. His director told him that as material food is necessary for the maintenance of the life of the body, so spiritual food, the church prayers, is necessary for the maintenance of the spiritual life. He believed this, and though the church services, for which he had to get up early in the morning, were a difficulty, they certainly calmed him and gave him joy. This was the result of his consciousness of humility, and the certainty that whatever he had to do, being fixed by the starets, was right. The interest of his life consisted not only in an ever greater and greater subjugation of his will, but in the attainment of all the Christian virtues, which at first seemed to him easily attainable. He had given his whole estate to his sister and did not regret it. He had no personal claims. Humility towards his inferiors was not merely easy for him but afforded him pleasure. Even victory over the sins of the flesh, greed and lust, was easily attained. His director had specially warned him against the latter sin, but Kosatsky felt free from it and was glad. One thing only tormented him, the remembrance of his fiancée, and not merely the remembrance but the vivid image of what might have been. Involuntarily he recalled a lady he knew who had been a favorite of the Emperor S, but had afterwards married and become an admirable wife and mother. The husband had a high position, influence and honor, and a good and penitent wife. In his better hours Kosatsky was not disturbed by such thoughts, and when he recalled them at such times he was merely glad to feel that the temptation was past. But there were moments when all that made up his present life suddenly grew dim before him, moments when, if he did not cease to believe in the aims he had set himself, he ceased to see them and could evoke no confidence in them but was seized by a remembrance of, and, terrible to say, a regret for, the change of life he had made. The only thing that saved him in that state of mind was obedience and work, and the fact that the whole day was occupied by prayer. He went through the usual forms of prayer, he bowed in prayer, he even prayed more than usual, but it was lip service only and his soul was not in it. This condition would continue for a day, or sometimes for 2 days, and would then pass of itself. But those days were dreadful. Kasatsky felt that he was neither in his own hands nor in God(s), but was subject to something else. All he could do then was to obey the starets, to restrain himself, to undertake nothing, and simply to wait. In general, all this time he lived not by his own will but by that of the starets, and in this obedience he found a special tranquility. So he lived in his first monastery for 7 years. At the end of the 3rd year he received the tonsure and was ordained to the priesthood by the name of Sergius. The profession was an important event in his inner life. He had previously experienced a great consolation and spiritual exaltation when receiving communion, and now when he himself officiated, the performance of the preparation filled him with ecstatic and deep emotion. But subsequently that feeling became more and more deadened, and once when he was officiating in a depressed state of mind he felt that the influence produced on him by the service would not endure. And it did in fact weaken till only the habit remained. In general, in the 7th year of his life in the monastery Sergius grew weary. He had learnt all there was to learn and had attained all there was to attain, there was nothing more to do and his spiritual drowsiness increased. During this time he heard of his mother(s) death and his sister Varvara(s) marriage, but both events were matters of indifference to him. His whole attention and his whole interest were concentrated on his inner life. In the 4th year of his priesthood, during which the bishop had been particularly kind to him, the starets told him that he ought not to decline it if he were offered an appointment to higher duties. Then monastic ambition, the very thing he had found so repulsive in other monks, arose within him. He was assigned to a monastery near the metropolis. He wished to refuse but the starets ordered him to accept the appointment. He did so, and took leave of the starets and moved to the other monastery. The exchange into the metropolitan monastery was an important event in Sergius(s) life. There he encountered many temptations, and his whole will-power was concentrated on meeting them. In the first monastery, women had not been a temptation to him, but here that temptation arose with terrible strength and even took definite shape. There was a lady known for her frivolous behavior who began to seek his favor. She talked to him and asked him to visit her. Sergius sternly declined, but was horrified by the definiteness of his desire. He was so alarmed that he wrote about it to the starets. And in addition, to keep himself in hand, he spoke to a young novice and, conquering his sense of shame, confessed his weakness to him, asking him to keep watch on him and not let him go anywhere except to service and to fulfill his duties. Besides this, a great pitfall for Sergius lay in the fact of his extreme antipathy to his new abbot, a cunning worldly man who was making a career for himself in the church. Struggle with himself as he might, he could not master that feeling. He was submissive to the abbot, but in the depths of his soul he never ceased to condemn him. And in the 2nd year of his residence at the new monastery that ill feeling broke out. The vigil service was being performed in the large church on the eve of the feast of the Intercession of the Blessed Virgin, and there were many visitors. The abbot himself was conducting the service. Father Sergius was standing in his usual place and praying. That is, he was in that condition of struggle which always occupied him during the service, especially in the large church when he was not himself conducting the service. This conflict was occasioned by his irritation at the presence of fine folk, especially ladies. He tried not to see them or to notice all that went on. How a soldier conducted them, pushing the common people aside, how the ladies pointed out the monks to one another, especially himself and a monk noted for his good looks. He tried as it were to keep his mind in blinkers, to see nothing but the light of the candles on the altar screen, the icons, and those conducting the service. He tried to hear nothing but the prayers that were being chanted or read, to feel nothing but self-oblivion in consciousness of the fulfillment of duty, a feeling he always experienced when hearing or reciting in advance the prayers he had so often heard. So he stood, crossing and prostrating himself when necessary, and struggled with himself, now giving way to cold condemnation and now to a consciously evoked obliteration of thought and feeling. Then the sacristan, Father Nicodemus, also a great stumbling block to Sergius, who involuntarily reproached him for flattering and fawning on the abbot, approached him and, bowing low, requested his presence behind the holy gates. Father Sergius straightened his mantle, put on his beretta, and went circumspectly through the crowd. Louise, regardez à droite, see est Louis. He heard a woman s voice say, "Oh, you? Il n est pas tellement beau." He knew that they were speaking of him. He heard them and, as always at moments of temptation, he repeated the words, "Lead us not into temptation," and bowing his head and lowering his eyes went past the ambo and in by the north door, avoiding the canons in their cassocks who were just then passing the altar screen. On entering the sanctuary he bowed, crossing himself as usual and bending double before the icons. Then, raising his head but without turning, he glanced out of the corner of his eye at the abbot, whom he saw standing beside another glittering figure. The abbot was standing by the wall in his vestments. Having freed his short plump hands from beneath his chasuble, he had folded them over his fat body and protruding stomach, and fingering the cords of his vestments was smilingly saying something to a military man in the uniform of a general of the imperial suite, with its insignia and shoulder knots which Father Sergius S experienced eye at once recognized. This general had been the commander of the regiment in which Sergius had served. He now evidently occupied an important position, and Father Sergius at once noticed that the abbot was aware of this and that his red face and bald head beamed with satisfaction and pleasure. This vexed and disgusted Father Sergius, the more so when he heard that the abbot had only sent for him to satisfy the general s curiosity to see a man who had formerly served with him, as he expressed it. "Very pleased to see you in your angelic guise," said the general, holding out his hand. "I hope you have not forgotten an old comrade." The whole thing, the abbot s red, smiling face amid its fringe of grey, the general s words, his well-cared-for face with its self-satisfied smile and the smell of wine from his breath and of cigars from his whiskers, revolted Father Sergius. He bowed again to the abbot and said, "Your reverence deigned to send for me," and stopped, the whole expression of his face and eyes asking why. "Yes, to meet the general," replied the abbot. "Your reverence, I left the world to save myself from temptation," said Father Sergius, turning pale and with quivering lips. "Why do you expose me to it during prayers and in God's house? You may go." "Go," said the abbot, flaring up and frowning. Next day Father Sergius asked pardon of the abbot and of the brethren for his pride, but at the same time, after a night spent in prayer, he decided that he must leave this monastery, and he wrote to the starets begging permission to return to him. He wrote that he felt his weakness and incapacity to struggle against temptation without his help and penitently confessed his sin of pride. By return of post came a letter from the starets, who wrote that Sergius S pride was the cause of all that had happened. The old man pointed out that his fits of anger were due to the fact that in refusing all clerical honors he humiliated himself not for the sake of God but for the sake of his pride. There now, am I not a splendid man not to want anything? That was why he could not tolerate the abbot S action. I have renounced everything for the glory of God, and here I am exhibited like a wild beast. Had you renounced vanity for God S sake you would have borne it. Worldly pride is not yet dead in you. I have thought about you, Sergius my son, and prayed also, and this is what God has suggested to me. At the Tambov hermitage the anchorite Hilary, a man of saintly life, has died. He had lived there 18 years. The Tambov abbot is asking whether there is not a brother who would take his place. And here comes your letter. Go to Father Pacy of the Tambov monastery. I will write to him about you, and you must ask for Hilary S cell. Not that you can replace Hilary, but you need solitude to quell your pride. May God bless you." Sergius obeyed the starets, showed his letter to the abbot, and having obtained his permission, gave up his cell, handed all his possessions over to the monastery, and set out for the Tambov hermitage. There the abbot, an excellent manager of merchant origin, received Sergius simply and quietly and placed him in Hilary-S cell, at first assigning to him a lay brother but afterwards leaving him alone, at Sergius' own request. The cell was a dual cave, dug into the hillside, and in it Hilary had been buried. In the back part was Hilary-S grave, while in the front was a niche for sleeping, with a straw mattress, a small table, and a shelf with icons and books. Outside the outer door, which fastened with a hook, was another shelf on which, once a day, a monk placed food from the monastery. And so Sergius became a hermit.
KaraokeBooks.